don't have to worry too much about your computers. I mean, whatever notes there are here and some references I can use later.
See, Lori, can you try to speak? No, speak slowly. Slowly.
Yeah, is there going to be translation?
C'è qualcuno che ha bisogno di una traduzione?
Per meglio capire, stare qui e stare via la mattinata.
Di parlare molto adagio.
Brava, coraggiosa.
Allora, se c'è un piccolo gruppo, come facciamo?
Ma possiamo darci i turni. Io adesso che sono un attimo, però
Sì.
qualcun altro può stare dietro a questa cosa qui.
Vicino al gruppo o sequenziale?
Chi è che avrebbe bisogno? 1, 2, 3. 4.
Allora, l'ideale sarebbe mettersi in un gruppo separato e qualcuno di noi viene vicino a voi e
Sì, proviamo a far così.
sussurra. Proviamo così? Ok, allora, magari in fondo lassù, così non disturbiamo gli altri, se gli altri vengono più vicini, così non... E posso cominciare io un po', poi dopo qualcuno un po' quando provo già...
Sì, io posso.
Cominciare tu? Così... No. È una domanda. Andiamoci per dire.
No, e comunque siccome lo scopo ovviamente è che capiamo tutti, cioè se anche chi non ha...
Ci vuole coraggio.
No, infatti, ma anche noi, se non capiamo qualcosa, cioè, interrompiamo. Piuttosto che per piacere.
Due parole per introdurre la professoressa Hanson, è la professoressa di Epidemiology e Community Health all'Università di Saskatchewan in Canada. Siamo venuti in contatto con lei in modo imprescrutabile perché ovviamente in qualche modo i comuni interessi si sono intersecati e il fatto sta che lei ha deciso l'anno scorso di spendere un po' un periodo del suo sabbatico qui con noi per condividere sia un po' le sue esperienze ma anche per vedere un po' come lavora il centro, come non lavora il centro. Stiamo approfittando di lei in vario modo, forse non abbastanza perché purtroppo è arrivato un momento di estremo impegno e poco spazio per motivi più vari, però uno dei modi in cui cerchiamo di utilizzare, di condividere appunto, abbiamo chiesto di condividere la sua esperienza su questo tema della Transformative Pedagogy of Education, che è un po' il tema dell'incontro del seminario di oggi, che immagino sarà molto interattivo e poco portale. Capisce qualcosa di italiano, forse più di quello che riesce a esprimere a parole, e parla molto meglio lo spagnolo perché ha legami lavorativi con l'America centrale Latino America, quindi per adesso cominciamo con l'inglese, poi magari la costringiamo a dire qualcosa in italiano, non so. Please.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I will try to speak slowly, and that's not easy for me because I get very passionate about these things.
Io sono Angelo Stuparino, chi mi conosce, sono il direttore scientifico.
So, just to start, I wanted to say thank you very much to Jessie. It's a mi piace molto. So I I'm going to give this seminar in a way that you will be involved. And I wanted to start with some recent conversations. Those conversations are ones that I think, to me, I hear an echo of the need to talk about this when I hear these conversations. And one of them was with Angelo. This week we were talking about university professors, and he said that he seldom runs into university professors that have ever been taught how to teach. He said we need to talk more about teaching and learning, and that's not something that when you come to be a university professor in the College of Medicine that you've ever learned how to teach. So that was one big conversation. I thought, oh, okay, so some teaching, this is a good idea. We talk about teaching. Then I went to the Medici presentation. A very good book. I recommend it probably to everybody. And that presentation, again, established for me the need to talk about teaching, the need to talk about learning. The students in the audience talked about medical education as oppressive. They talked about medical education as creating passive subjects. They talked about medical education as dehumanizing. They talked about medical education as demoralizing. What are we doing? The third thing that brings me to think that this might be a good idea to talk about this today is the experiences in the Jesse. There's many experiences that many people have that they feel are transformative. They're experiences of learning. They're experiences of engagement with communities. They're experiences of activism. And they feel that they're learning a great deal from them. And something is changing inside of them. And something is changing outside of CSI. So these are all things that make me like, okay, this seminar is worth talking. This topic is worth talking about. There's people here in this building, in this room, that are talking about this. I have some assumptions that I make when I come into a room, and some limitations. This is really a course of study. It's not doable in 3 hours. So there's some limitations and there's some assumptions. So one assumption, I'm going to try to make this a student-centered seminar. So, but it's also aimed at talking about how we as facilitators or teachers, how we work with students. So it's mainly talking about university preparation of professionals for engaging outside of the university. That doesn't mean that's the only place to facilitate learning. That doesn't mean that it's the best place to facilitate learning, but it is where all of us are right now. So also, an assumption that I make is how we are with our students in a university classroom will be reflected in their practice when they leave the university. I also make an assumption that you and the students you're working with are mostly professionals. So we're not talking here about student engagement with communities so much as student engagement in terms of their formation. Nothing that I say today cannot be contested. Nothing that I say today is not contestable. That's a given. And I admit today is partly educational theory, is partly lots of experience, and is partly informed opinion. I have some things that I have discarded and I don't believe in because I've tried them and it worked. That's not an informed opinion. So I also said today was going to be rumination. We're going to go here, and then we're going to go here, and then we're going to go here, and here. Most learning is not linear. Most learning doesn't happen like that. So if I'm going to reflect on things, some things will resonate with you, some things won't. That's okay. I've also, I've heard about, I've been to a few Italian seminars, and I don't usually use so much paper. That's not the way I usually teach, but my impression of the Italian classroom is that it's a very formal place. Very formal place. And the discourses that I've heard are non-stop with very little interaction except at the end. So this is not going to be an Italian student. So I hope that's okay. I wouldn't know how to do that. Instead, so as you know here, I'll be with you working through these ideas, but it's not my. This is not going to be my product. This is going to be a collective product. You'll get out of it what you want, and hopefully I won't do too much of this. So this is what I will try to combine doing a bit of this with a bit of some more interactions. One reason that I want to do a bit of this is I also want to provide some ideas. Again, my assumption is that you're all in teaching and learning roles here. So I want to try to provide some ideas about adult education principles, and as well to do some alternative kinds of ways of learning that you can use if you want to use them, and also have what is called a double dialogue. Okay. So a double dialogue is where we will maybe engage in a few exercises. We'll go through those, and then we'll pull ourselves out, and we will dialogue about the actual exercise itself. It's a way to put to sort of insert a bit more pedagogical training into the actual doing of exercises. So I call it a double dialogue. In adult education, there's some basic principles. It's pretty straightforward. Anthropologists of education, I'm sure you've taken a look at this. You're all adults. I'm making the assumption that we are here as adults, we're not here. So maybe I should correctly call this a seminar about andragogy. That's a contested. Maybe you can tell me. I see heads nodding. Andragogy, of course, is adult education. Pedagogy is education of children, but we just call it pedagogy now because there's too many debates in that field. So let's just say, in adult education, there are some basic principles that have been learned. We're not going to go through all of them, but basically, the more senses that are involved in learning, the more you retain of your learning. That's a constant adult education process. That's a given. So if I stay here and I talk too much, and you don't talk, you're not going to retain what I said. It doesn't stay. If you get to interact a bit more, some more things stay in your mind. And the more senses that you involve in doing in adult education, the more you retain. So when you're actually involved physically in doing some work, you retain a lot more learning than when you're listening. Okay. So all of those are just prefaces. What I would ask today is that people relax. Education happens best, and transformative education requires a sense of freedom and a sense of safety. If you don't have that in a classroom, you're not going to be able to help people to transform how they think about things and how they act. So if people don't feel safe enough to talk, to question, to be involved, chances are that they're not going to have the courage to be able to enact changes in themselves or with other people. So this class, I'm going to try to keep it, try to keep it as light as we can. Here's a few things that might help. If you hear something that you really like, you can twinkle. Everybody knows what twinkling is. Have you seen twinkle? Twinkling. Everybody know? Okay. What's twinkling? Mariana, what's twinkling? I don't know what it's explained. Oh, in Italiano. Okay, so what's twinkling? Somebody else?
Yeah. No, vai, scusa, l'ha chiesto a te.
So when it is a way to use hands instead of voice, so it is another our body communicating instead of the speak. And for example, with this, we are meaning that we agree or we like what is happening. And then with this, it means that we don't like, we disagree at all. And this, it means please change. We have already said it is not something like that.
What was the first?
And can you use also our tongue?
Yeah, sure. If you feel that you're falling asleep or that it's boring, it really turns you off, you can't stand this anymore, that you really, really need a change in the tone of what's going on, stand up. Stop the music.
And maybe, no, I have just that this is the way that the examiners use in their manifestation.
Sure.
Automation of their activities.
Yes. Lots of parts of the world for helping to organize big groups. You can organize thousands of people and get an idea from thousands of people how well the conversation is going. Fascinating. I don't know if you've ever seen any videos from the Seattle meetings, the pre-Seattle meetings, pre-Calgary, pre-Quebec City, all of them, lots of them. But anyway, so use your body to tell me how it's going for you. And also, sometimes what helps a little bit is for kind of you to turn off other things, turn off other influences. So, does anybody have anything happening this morning that they have to be on contact with? Email, texting, telephones. Anybody have anything they have to connect with? No? Because we'll turn them off. We don't need it. Just turn it off. If you don't need it, if you have nothing really urgent that's going to happen in the next 3 hours, turn off that extra noise. Don't need it. So we'll start with I said that I was going to talk about some concepts. We'll start with one by actually doing a bit of a very needed concept. And that's the concept of reflexivity, understanding who we are. So I have some questions for you so that we can start to understand who we are as a group. Let's see, raise your hands if you're from Bologna. Okay, so only two. Raise your hands if you are from Brazil. You definitely. And raise your hand if you're from some other country beyond this. Okay, where from? From?
I was born in Jerusalem.
Okay. Okay. And how many of you here are from rural backgrounds?
Rural.
From rural. Countryside, campus.
We say good.
So when they were the child. How many of you have at least one professional parent? University trained parent?
Genitore che ha formazione universitaria.
At least one. How many of you have two professional parents? Okay. How many of you have very good feet? How many of you have single parent homes?
Un solo single. Una famiglia con un solo genitore.
Okay. So few, not too many. Okay. Let's see. How many of you here have taught university courses?
Hanno insegnato in università. Beh.
Don't be afraid to put your hands up. I haven't seen something like this. Okay. So how many here have considered, and you don't have to answer this question, but this is an important question, some of the things about your own self-identification. So, no. Self-identification. So, how you identify. What is your gender? What is your social class? What is your racial and ethnic identity? What was the question? Think about yourself. What is your gender? What is your sexual orientation? What is your religion? What is your social class? In terms of income, in terms of education.
You mean we already just classified ourselves?
That's right. Just think about that. There's a slide that sometimes I'll put up. It's an old story called "If the World Were a Village of 100 People." You heard of that?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So on that slide, it reduces the world population to 100 people and asks us to think about how many people out of those 100 in the world would be university educated. If the world were only 100 people, one person will have a university education. That's important. That's extremely important in this context. You, we, us, we are not like most of the world. Most of the world does not have a university education. Most of the world is not professional. There are a number of other considerations on there. Most of the world is not white.
White.
Caucasian, white. And so forth. And what that brings us to is this. The question, waiver, if you want to go back into the theory, I think Max Weber was the first person to really talk about the questions of social status and the importance of considering the place of having political and economic power. And he never called it this, but he was indicating levels of privilege. So when we're in a university education, we're very much influenced by these things. I asked you a few questions. I think it's only fair that I also respond. Just quickly, briefly, because this is an important topic, but maybe one that we can't get to. I'm going to just pause here for a moment. One thing that we don't do enough of in universities, especially, is to consider the role of privilege in blinding our subject, in forming our subjectivity. All of these privileges come with baggage. And the concept of privilege is a concept that acts like something invisible. We don't talk about it, we don't think about it often enough. So we're blinded to it. Peggy McIntosh has talked about privilege as an invisible backpack. And particularly if you are white, male, professional, heterosexual, able, you have a lot of invisible privilege. You can walk into a store and you will not be questioned. You have all kinds of privileges in terms of access to resources that if you're missing one of those things, you don't have. And so she talks about it, and I recommend, if you're interested in this concept, that you look her up. There's many theorists that talk about the role of privilege in affecting our subjectivity. So Peggy McIntosh is one who talks about this idea of privilege being an invisible backpack. And you can, for yourself, you can think about what that means. One of the exercises that sometimes I'll get students to do is to go to a cosmetics section of a store and take a look. In Canada, we're a very multicultural society. And if you go to the cosmetics section, flesh-colored Band-Aids are white. Flesh-colored Band-Aids are white.
Cerotti.
All the eye drops are blue eyes, etc., etc., etc. We see ourselves everywhere, represented in dominant society. So privilege becomes invisible to us.
Cerotto è bianco perché è più pulito, perché è una questione razziale, cerotto bianco.
Well, they call it flesh-colored. Flesh
Color carne. Color carne. Cioè nel senso l'etichetta è color carne.
What it means, though, it's just symbolic, but what it means is that if you are white, male, professional, heterosexual, able-bodied, you see yourself represented in all kinds of roles all the time. So it's invisible to you how many privileges you carry. And it's difficult to talk about in a group of university students because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good to talk about those things because we like to think of ourselves as closer to people that are unlike ourselves. I'm not going to get into it in any depth. But there's another one that matters. So, okay, I asked you a few questions about you. Mariana asked me to talk a little bit about this. And I think it matters a bit. It's a perspective, but in a transformative setting, it's only fair if I ask you about questions about you that I tell you something about me. And I'm not any different than people that I'm working with in a teacher-student role. So a few things that for me affect my subjectivity, affect the way I see things, are, well, there are thousands, of course, but three things that to me have always come back to be very important to how I see the world. One is that shape especially, I guess, my ideas on learning. One is the fact that I'm from a rural background. I'm from a farm. My father had grade 6 education. My father had grade 6 education.
Elementary.
Very, very elementary education. We lived on the land that was given to my grandparents by the state of Canada, the Dominion of Canada. Okay? We lived, I can't even reach this thing. We lived in how do you reach that? Saskatchewan.
There's a stick.
Oh. I'm from Saskatchewan, this place, in the middle of nowhere. So in the discourse of in the colonial discourse, I'm from Saskatchewan, in the country of Canada. And then when we start to think about a little bit more about where we're actually from and how many forces of domination and colonialization we carry inside, I actually live in Treaty 6 land. That's where I'm from. All of Canada is only there because of an agreement with the Aboriginal people. But I grew up with the myth. I grew up with the myth that I was from a settler pioneer family that had worked very hard to survive.
Avete strappato la terra agli indiani. Avete strappato la terra agli indiani.
Taken away.
The process, not our families did not do that. The state did that. Okay? The way that the system works, the state made arrangements for people to come. The people that came were poor. The people that came were working class, were farmers from, in my case, they were farmers from Ukraine.
From?
Ukraine. This affects my subjectivity. I grew up thinking something about how Canada was formed, and that affected how I thought about the world. I also grew up in a left-wing, rural, cooperative, leftist party, community-oriented people. That from the time I was very small. I did not understand urban people very well. The second piece is that it's important to tie this together because we did not speak, when I was young, we did not speak in terms of treaties. We spoke in terms of provinces and states. We spoke with the narrative. We spoke in the school, in my community. We spoke in terms of being from a province and a community. We did not talk about being on treaty land. That narrative of being from a settler family on land that's given to us, that's our land, is a narrative that hides the privilege of being on Aboriginal land. So privilege hides in the narratives we tell ourselves. Other learning experiences that shaped my views on learning were, I was in radical free schools as a young teenager. I got lucky. I had some radical free school experiences in Canada, United States, Norway. And no grades, no rewards for being there, no certificates, no degrees, just learning. And the third big influence on my life was the years that I passed in Nicaragua during the Nicaraguan Revolution. So I lived in Nicaragua for 6 years. I lived there during the Counter-Revolutionary War. And for 30 years since then, I've been working with groups of women campesinas in Nicaragua. The lingering question for me, especially from the Nicaraguan experience, is this. In my mind, what happened? What happened to that big social transformation experience in Nicaragua? What happened? What happened to make that social transformation experience fail, if you believe that's a failure, or to change? It's no longer a revolution now. Something happened that didn't permit it to go on. And my personal conviction, growing from many years of reflection on this question, is that social transformation has to be linked to personal transformation. And nobody can be left out of that equation. You can't have social transformation for groups, particular groups that are traditionally dominated, for example, by men, and leave half of the population out of the equation. The social experiment won't work. So we have to pay attention all the time to both personal and social transformation. That's my conviction.
Okay, we want to know why you went to Nicaragua.
No. I self-defined and identified myself from a very early age with left politics. In the 1980s, for the Americas in particular, but for the whole world in a way, what was going on in Central America was the first real regional indication of a large change to capitalist structures in the world. It was a promise of something different. And it was a promise of something different that was not solely a social movement, but that was actually taking place in a whole country. And it was regional, and revolutions were happening. The revolutionary movements were happening all around Central America and in some other places. And I wanted to be part of that. I had worked for that for many years in Canada as a solidarity activist. So I would say above everything, above all things, it was my political beliefs, my value system, my wanting to be a solidarity activist, my belief in internationalism, which is a concept that's changed now. Don't get me started, there's lots of reasons. But those are principles, those are main goals. Okay, I'm going to switch gears again. This is a rumination. A rumination. Okay, so first set of things to consider when we're trying to deal with questions of transformation is who are we? Who are we? Reflexivity. Where does our subjectivity come from? What does that blind us to? What's needed? That's the first set of sort of questions to think about. The next set of questions is around epistemology. And they're related, obviously they're related. The questions around epistemology. I have a joke for you. Let's see if it translates. Okay, so there's an academic is driving out to do some field work, and he passes by a farmer, and he hopes to recruit that farmer as one of his study participants. So the academic researcher says, "Ciao, I bet I can tell you how many sheep you have grazing on your farm." "Oh, really?" says the farmer. The researcher pulls out a global positioning system, a GPS, and she calculates the exact geographic position and the altitude of each parcel on the farm. And then she says, do you know that you have 17 sheep? And the best one got lost. And so I picked him up and I put him in the back of my truck. Don't mention the favor. I know that you'll pay me back. The farmer looks up, has a grin on her face, and says, I bet I know who you are. I bet I know where you're going. You must be an academic. First, because you didn't ask permission to come here. You didn't ask permission to work in our community. Third, because you used high technology and big words to tell me information that I already know. And fourth, because that's my dog in the back of your truck. Let me ask you a question of you, just we have a lot of questions. I mean, one of the things that came out of the seminar on Medici Senza Cambici, can't say that word.
That's okay, pretty good.
Was questions about a real questioning of the biomedical knowledge as being the only knowledge that's ever taught in medical school. There are lots of kinds of knowledge. Can we name a few? What are a few kinds of knowledge beyond biomedical knowledge? What are a few other kinds of knowledge?
Social science.
Okay, social sciences. What about outside of the university? What's the farmer's knowledge? That was just in the joke. Practical knowledge. Practical knowledge. What else? Popular knowledge.
Traditional knowledge.
Traditional knowledge. Emotional knowledge. Environmental knowledge. Okay. And let's just continue about that. So what kind of knowledge, I mean, the first question, in the way we all know, what kind of knowledge we use in the university, how much practical, traditional, indigenous, popular knowledge is taught in the university, how much it's valued in the university system.
I was thinking about form of knowledge. I mean, we forgot about it's called the Gramscian common sense. I mean,
Common sense.
What is sold as a knowledge, which is not, which is produced by somebody else and given to common people. No, dicevo anche c'è un altro tipo di conoscenza che è quello che Gramsci chiamava il senso comune, nel senso l'opinione pubblica che in genere viene creata dai grandi media, dal potere costituito, non è una conoscenza che viene da noi, molto spesso è una conoscenza un po' fuorviante.
What do we try to do along when we teach? This is a real problematic area. Okay, let me reframe that. We're trying to teach. I'm making an assumption that the teaching that I'm talking about with you here is trying to help students to become better engaged as citizens, as activists, with communities. So what's the problem with teaching just science? What's the problem with teaching scientific, rational knowledge only?
Well, if you do it with this attitude, there's no problem. If you do it with this same attitude you mentioned, there's no problem, because if this is your point, your mission, you can teach everything, and it works. I think.
opportunities in study.
You mean science neutral? I'm trained more as a social scientist, and objectivity died in 1955 for me personally, but yeah. I can't take myself outside of reality and observe it. I can't do that. That's absolutely impossible. It's not possible to remove yourself. The questions that we ask in science, whether you're taking biology, chemistry, physics, or any kind of biomedical sciences, by the questions that we ask, by the subjects that are used, by the way that they're analyzed, those are all value-laden judgments, every single one. There's no such thing as objects. Sorry, I don't want to go into that discussion.
Beh, però deve essere ripetibile da chiunque.
Is that?
He said that it has to be relatable from by everyone. I don't know. I wanted to say that I agree, but I think volevo dire che sono d'accordo, però penso che in realtà nella maggior parte, cioè per quanto anche questo a livello accademico e teorico sia stato criticato e in tanti modi anche dimostrato, tra virgolette, che non è possibile una descrizione oggettiva, che non c'è una realtà esterna da descrivere, però è quello su cui funziona in realtà tutta la nostra società, cioè tutta la conoscenza scientifica, nella maggior parte, e anche nelle scienze umane in realtà tantissimo è ancora così, nonostante sia stato messo in discussione. Quindi anche se possiamo dire che è criticabile, però è reale perché viene utilizzato e si produce conoscenza in questo modo.
Sì, quindi
non possiamo fare finta che non ci sia.
Yeah, it produces a certain kind of knowledge, useful for certain kinds of things.
Sì, no, io sono d'accordo.
But not necessarily useful at all times for all things. See? And the problem, as Vandana Shiva says, the problem actually comes, the central problem is not that there's many kinds of knowledges. The central problem is what's validated as valid knowledge. And the problem with teaching this idea to students is that if we never discuss, if we never take into consideration, and if we never really start to get a little bit more humble about what science can and cannot do, then we're not helping our students when they arrive to work with contadini, when they arrive to work maybe in Brazil with people in impoverished community. We're not helping them to be able to communicate more effectively. We're not helping them to be able to validate what people already know. We're asking them to go and to impose a different kind of knowledge system that they inside themselves think is better, think is valid. We have to break apart. If we want people to be able to work in transformative ways with people that are not university trained, especially. If we want to be able to prepare our students to work with people that are not university trained, we have to learn to recognize, validate, and be humble before the other kinds of knowledge that we don't know. The guy with the GPS in the truck didn't even know that it was a dog, not a sheep. The questions that are important to consider if you're going to try to help students come out of their bubble of scientific learning. There's something else that happens around epistemology, and it comes back to the idea of privilege. The kind of knowledge that's created in universities the validation of knowledge that's created in universities creates an epistemic privilege. So some voices, some opinions, some understandings come to be more important than others. This is what Vandana Shiva says when she says a hierarchy of knowledge.
E ci sarebbe bisogno di una definizione di epistemologico massimo solida, perché
okay. Epistemology is the science of the study of the creation of validation of knowledge. So it's about knowledge creation and about knowledge validation. In a nutshell. When there's an epistemic privilege, when there's a certain form of knowledge that's privileged over another kind of knowledge, there's a barrier that's created for communication. There's a barrier that's created that keeps people oppressed. We don't know sometimes, and this is where some of the authors have written, we don't really know how people think, act, survive, and so forth. For example, the ultra poor. And it asks, sociologists ask questions like, can the subaltern speak? Can the subaltern speak? Okay, I just lost it. If the language that is available is only a language of the dominant classes, to express themselves, the oppressed needs to use the language of the dominant classes. And that does not represent their experience. So, let me use an example. Maybe, for your age, this is an important example. For many years, the field of sexuality studies, sex studies, used the language and the familiar terms and the way of understanding sexual response that was available through a male-centered system. It was only post-Kinsey and so forth that people actually came up with the idea that there were actually different experiences going on. Kinsey, others, that people started to question, said, wait, this doesn't represent the real experience. We're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole here. This is not right. This doesn't fit the experience. Because the language, the knowledge, the way of communicating about it doesn't fit. So epistemic privilege allows some things to be said because there's a language for it, because it's validated, and other things can't be said because there's no language for it. People don't have a way of articulating their experience in a way for others to understand. Okay, these are thick ideas. I said this was a whole course. This is not 3 hours. So I'm just ruminating through important ideas. When we had a conversation, with a group that was teaching at JSE, and I asked them, what are the epistemologies underlying the course you're teaching? What are you trying to help people understand from a knowledge perspective, from a validation of truth perspective? And it's something that needs to be thought through, because if we want people to be able to communicate outside of our own little university language, we have to think about these things. Well, let's just leave it at that. I'm seeing blank faces. Maybe this makes it a little bit more familiar. Activist knowledge.
Don't die.
Okay. Activist knowledge. Angelo, you've been thinking about this for a while. How you know that something gets created by the work of the JSE Chiara knows that any of the people that have been working for some time that have been working in activist circles know that there's something you learn and that there's something that is worth articulating and that that's a powerful weapon. And in an academic journal that's dedicated to social movements, they talk, their whole first issue is actually about ways that activists try to make knowledge. So they create alternative narratives about things that are going on. I'm not going to read the screen, you can read it yourself. This is a complex area. Epistemology, there's courses on epistemology. You can actually get a master's degree in epistemology at some university. So in 15 minutes, I can't do much justice, but it's important. Let's make it a little bit interesting. We're going to do a little bit of just an introduction to this, and then we're going to do some exercises that are practicing stuff. This is the first slide, moving into theme number 3, concept number 3. Leave that one for a side. They're all related, but we'll get there. Go back to pedagogy. And what do you understand pedagogy to be at this point? What's pedagogy?
The art of knowing how to teach, how to interact to people who want to learn.
Literally for children.
Yeah, it was literally for children. And then came Knowles, and then came G, and then came the discussions. Is adult learning differently from learning with children? And then came the idea that some of the things that we know about children's learning actually pertains to adults, and some adults act more like kids, and some kids act more like adults. So maybe we should just go back to calling it pedagogy. That's in a nutshell. So now we still use pedagogy. In adult education, the word pedagogy has come back. But you're right. It's a reflection on how. So when we stand up and we talk, you don't have icebergs in Italy, do you? Icebergs. Bird. No. This is a really easy concept in Canada because everybody knows what an iceberg is in Canada. An iceberg is a large chunk of ice that is broken off from a glacier and comes floating down through the ocean.
No, we know. It's just that it's spelled iceberg. That's what's confusing. Not iceberg. It's with an E. So that's why we're figuring if it's a different type. Yeah. Maybe in Canada you have icebergs instead of icebergs.
Pedagogy is about all of the parts of teaching and all of the parts of learning that are under the water that you can't see. So, that little piece that's sticking out at the top is what is the content. It's, this is content, and this is content, but the process is all the stuff under the water. You can't see it. And that's where pedagogy is. Since it makes it easier. I wanted to just do a bit of, I want to switch up so that we can actually get some involvement, so we can think about different ways to do things. Because pedagogy is also about, it's something that we use not just in teaching situations, but actually processes of doing something are very important to think about in terms of primary health care, in terms of activist work. So I wanted to do an exercise with you. And the way that we're going to do this exercise is to think about what's under the water. Okay. So the exercise, let's see, we can divide it in, we're going to divide it into 2 groups. It's going to be tricky to do, and here, could one of the groups go, could we use the rooms here beside? Okay. And what we're going to ask, there's a case study, and the first case study is called Implementing Primary Healthcare. And it's just a short story, and I want you to ask of yourselves, read the short story together as a group, and ask the question, how are they working? So when you're looking for how somebody does something, you look for the verbs. That's just it. Okay. So you can think about, I mean, you can go as deep into this as you care to. You can think about the positionality of people. You can think about the subjectivity. You can think about what kind of assumptions they're making about knowledge. You can do a whole lot of things. But for this exercise, we'll just think about how they're working. And we're going to give you a large piece of paper and would ask that you draw the process. Draw it, diagram, draw a brief, capture briefly how they have come up with this. Okay? So maybe just right with you come on this side, and everybody, you can stay on this side, and you, sorry, what's your name? Okay, Antoine, you go with this side. And to make it, I guess, a little bit more group, if we can sit around the desk or something.
How much?
I have a few copies, not too many.
How much time we'll have?
And for the first part, let's keep this brief. Let's keep it brief. Let's keep it at, say, see if you can do this in 10 to 15 minutes max. I'll give you 15 to do it. Max.
This book stays here?
Yeah. Well, or they can find another place where they can work on a computer. It's not so easy.
Sì, vieni, devo andare anch'io.
Ehi.
Most didactic seminars that are So there's the papers. Here's the case study.
Yeah, ci sono qua. Ci possiamo mettere per... Questo è un gruppo? Siamo qua? Qui. Se no... Can you see? Grazie, devo andare solo un cavolo.
Mi sembra andiamo di là. Sì, le faccio vedere.
What he has to do exactly? He has to grow up a man.
Merenda.
Merenda. Merenda.
E ma insomma sono un po' così. Vabbè. Dai, non ho letto, ciao, ho letto l'oggetto ma poi ho spento il computer.
Occupare energia, è un po' cloudy nella cabeza, güey.
Sì. Ti do il numero della mia dentista, lo vedrai che ci stiamo scrivendo. È molto bravo. Ah, mi sa quando è poi. Vabbè, vado un attimo in bagno.
Mi chiedono lo spiego.
Do you want to paste them up here? Somebody can, one more Okay, so can somebody from the first group just tell us briefly, very briefly, we can see what you did, but tell us what you did.
Penso che tu dovresti parlare. Io? In italiano? Sì. Aspetta che.
Somebody come up. Allora, come potete vedere dal grafico che abbiamo disegnato noi, in qualche modo dalla lettura è venuto fuori che il soggetto principale è la PHC, ovvero il gruppo di operatori di salute che lavora sul territorio. Volutamente abbiamo messo da una parte tutte le emergenze del territorio, traumi, violenze sessuali, la depressione, lo stress, quello che c'era nella prima parte della lettura, come qualcosa che emerge dalla comunità e arriva alla PHC, e dall'altra i questionari che sono uno dei metodi utilizzati dalla PHC, l'unico in realtà espresso inizialmente, per valutare quello che accade nella comunità, come una freccia con due punti, ovvero una freccia con due punti in quanto la PHC elabora i questionari, quindi sa già cosa cercare, e allo stesso tempo elabora le risposte, ovvero dalle risposte poi pensa quello che è più giusto fare sul territorio. E le risposte sono da quest'altra parte, ovvero interventi sullo stile di vita e sulla nutrizione, quindi le classi per cucinare per i genitori, la vaccinazione, eccetera, e l'identificazione dei gruppi ad alto rischio, ovviamente per la sicurezza sessuale, l'abuso di droghe, la clinica pre-postnatale e infine queste cliniche mobili che vanno nei territori rurali. Alla fine di tutta questa organizzazione sul territorio ci sono questi incontri di comunità in cui la PHC cerca di capire se tutti i partecipanti hanno capito le informazioni che sono state trasmesse. In realtà questo finale dovrebbe ritornare alla PHC, ovvero come un ritorno al lavoro della PHC, non come qualcosa che ritorna alla comunità. Infatti questa freccia rossa indica che sì, la comunità in qualche modo partecipa a quello che fa la PHC, ma in qualche modo è strumentalizzato allo stesso tempo dalla PHC stessa, ovvero la PHC elabora i bisogni e le risposte e la comunità partecipa, quindi come un soggetto in qualche modo passivo, in realtà. Partecipano passivamente.
Ok, l'analisi dopo.
Ok, so, ma in realtà non penso di aver concluso. Quindi abbiamo messo uno.
No, perfetto, dai.
No.
Più o meno era la stessa cosa, abbiamo disegnato diversamente. Noi ci siamo immaginati, siccome nel testo appare che i professionisti professionisti sono sovraccaricati, sono un sacco di problematiche nel territorio e il servizio sa che la PHC è la strategia migliore, elabora una serie di questionari per valutare quello che già sa. Quindi utilizza questi questionari e individua dei gruppi a rischio, però lui già sapeva quali erano i gruppi a rischio e quindi sapendo, conoscendo i gruppi a rischio, vedendo quali erano le problematiche, fa degli interventi che sostanzialmente sono dei corsi di servizi eccetera, che ricadono direttamente con la comunità e dopo organizza degli incontri per nel caso modificare.
Ok. Same exercise, very different case. So remember, try as much as you can to listen to the verbs. Okay, when we want to listen for how things are done, not what things are done, how things are done, listen for the verbs. Okay, so case 2, 15 minutes or so, maybe 20, this is a little longer. Okay.
non mi scoccio, così facciamo il lavoro perché sennò perde la propria.
Giusto per dire un attimo.
I want to come and talk to this one. Okay, so who's with this one?
Siamo tutti qua?
Let's start with the other group. I don't know, they disappeared. Oh, questa l'altra fatto
Allora, una volta l'abbiamo fatto un po' più creativi, abbiamo scelto
Cercheremo di
live
venderlo sul mercato,
perché ci piaceva mettere in luce tutta una serie di pratiche che spesso appunto stanno sotto e non partono mai a galla. Sono pratiche in realtà che permettono nascoste perché non siamo molto abituati a fare quindi l'iceberg seriamente. È per lei che cosa ti piace dell'iceberg?
No, semplicemente in realtà era semplice perché abbiamo inventato un po' l'immagine di prima, però in realtà è molto chiaro e sintetico e anche dice tutto. La parte alla fine del contenuto rimane piccolo, il contenuto se non c'è una ripetitiva parte che il metodo che si usa e quindi ci siamo soffermati sui verbi appunto, come c'era scritto, e sono venute fuori un sacco di cose. Come?
Allora, noi siamo partiti dal fatto che alla base di tutto c'è l'ascolto, quindi Jenny farà più che il proprio mestiere, impara soprattutto a ascoltare gli altri, ascoltare non solo le parole delle persone ma anche l'emozione, quindi quello che di inespresso c'è, quello che rimane oltre le parole. E quindi attraverso l'ascolto, che poi per lei non è un semplice ascolto appunto di parole, ma proprio un ascolto attraverso anche situazioni più tranquille che possano mettere a proprio agio gli altri, arriva a capire proprio quali sono le esigenze di base delle persone che incontra, crea delle relazioni, crea dei gruppi e quindi che cosa fa? Una volta capiti i grandi temi, non decide semplicemente di creare una strategia, ma decide di riproporli alla comunità in una maniera che loro possano condividere e quindi introduce la creatività e quindi l'arte, decide di fare dei disegni, delle foto, in maniera che la comunità in qualche maniera possa riconoscersi nell'emozione, nella problematica, nel disagio, e si possa riconoscere, diciamo che tiene conto di tutte le individualità, perché tiene conto delle individualità che sono più affini alle parole, delle individualità che sono più affini alle immagini, quindi diciamo che è un approccio molto inclusivo. E poi una volta appunto riproposti questi temi, chiede alla comunità se si riconosce in questi temi, quindi li coinvolge a livello emotivo, e a questo punto chiede a loro delle soluzioni, cioè nel senso pensiamo insieme delle soluzioni. Quindi anche qui è una richiesta di coinvolgimento molto inclusiva, nel senso che si crea un ambiente giusto affinché possano uscire delle cose. Quindi semplicemente non si dà la giustificazione, ok, nessuno mi risponde, nessuno mi parla, allora vado avanti sulla mia strada, ma cerco di creare i presupposti per cui ognuno possa essere libero di esprimersi. E poi per arrivare al feedback, quindi a quello che viene fuori da questo suo lavoro sotterraneo, per cui appunto si creano delle relazioni, si creano delle buone risposte a livello di soluzioni, e quindi anche le istituzioni riescono a in qualche maniera rispondere a delle idee che funzionano, e poi si moltiplica l'energia, si moltiplicano le pratiche, chi ha appreso insegna o cerca di insegnare.
Sì, quindi lei vuole annullare quella che è la strategia della gerarchia di una conoscenza su un altro tipo di conoscenza, assicurandosi per esempio di chiedere appunto sempre il riscontro, un feedback, e fare dei piccoli grandi accorgimenti anche di comunicazione, di contatto emotivo, in cui la comunità si sente coinvolta ed è realmente attiva, non soltanto sulla carta. E quindi il gusto di verbo.
Mi è stato incaricato perché gli altri si vergognavano di presentare cosa ho cercato di riassumere in questa figura. Evidentemente la figura dovrebbe essere vista come standing, in piedi. Allora, secondo noi questa immagine di una persona in cui vengono esasperati in un certo senso gli organi di senso, vedere, sentire, il udire, il parlare, anche il gusto stesso, e il toccare, quindi i sensi, rappresentano appunto le idee che secondo noi vanno sottolineati in questo testo. A cominciare soprattutto con la prima frase, quando la Jenny fa il corso e impara i listening skills, cioè la capacità di ascoltare gli altri. E questo è appunto ovviamente raffigurato con un altro verbo centrale che qui è messo in forma verbale, comunque, è quello di generare, i temi generativi, i generative themes, che vengono utilizzati per, usando un termine freudiano, per coscientizzare la popolazione, per rendere la popolazione consapevole della propria situazione, dei propri bisogni, ma anche delle proprie risorse. Ovviamente il tema, il verbo generare viene rappresentato qui con gli organi riproduttivi della donna, cioè con i seni e con l'utero gravido. E questi di nuovo per aggiungere un ulteriore verbo, se rimaniamo sui verbi, Altri verbi centrali sono, abbiamo visto, sono quelli di assistere la popolazione a sviluppare le loro idee, riformulare i propri commenti. Infine, l'altro verbo che abbiamo voluto raffigurare, enfatizzare in questa figura è quella dell'avere fiducia in se stessi, della self-confidence, che qui viene raffigurato con i piedi grandi, nel senso che la persona si poggia con sicurezza sul terreno e si sente sicuro in quello che fa. Adesso non ricordo bene perché
c'è la pratica dell'orto.
Sì, ovviamente, poi c'è la pratica
i frutti
e anche l'inizio dell'autostima.
La sospensione della pratica e degli skills che hanno acquisito questa popolazione, per cui ecco, qui praticamente c'è un po' tutti gli aspetti più significativi che secondo noi sono contenuti in questa storia.
Devo solo aggiungere una cosa che abbiamo parlato un attimo, ma le capacità grafiche del gruppo dell'unità, che poi comunque, nel senso che questo è tutto un discorso collettivo, lì c'è solo una persona, perché non è uno, è tutti. Cioè, sviluppando tutti questi verbi alla fine arrivava a un sentire collettivo, quindi li ho riassunti.
Let's just ask a couple of quick questions, just in the interest of time. There's a lot involved in this exercise, but what's the same about these two cases? What's the same?
community.
What's the same? This way of working and this way of working, what's the same?
Well, there are people involved.
There's people involved, okay? There's two problems with communities. What about the professionals involved? Is there anything that's common?
They're professionals.
They're professionals. They all care. They all want to do something. They all want to move something forward, right? They're all working on that. But of course, their approaches are very different. So what's central about the differences? What's different? Central differences?
First of all, the drawings we made and another pattern we use for the others. So refer to us how we change the way of acting.
Okay.
Non suggerire di rispondere in italiano, tanto lei
Yeah, no, there's no problem. I can't speak very much Italian. I can understand a little bit more. Independence.
In the second case, the researchers are studying to include that they might have a solution to the problem. They might know what's wrong with them. But in the first case, the research work seems to think that the people, they are my object.
Right. Participation. Okay, so there are many things that are very, very different about the two approaches. This is perhaps a way that we can see in community work the effect of how we teach. These people are experts in their field. They care. They're open. They've learned many things in school about primary health care. They've learned about target groups. They've learned about interventions. Right? They've been told how to approach communities in a top-down way. Who's participating here? Where do you see the participation? This is just, there's one of many scales. Transformation has as one of its central concepts participation for a reason. And you could see it in these two approaches. what happens when people participate. A very simple diagram. When things are essentially decided by other people, usually that's accompanied by a very low level of participation. Right? And yes, the community is receiving benefits by these programs, but they don't have much decision making, so they're not very empowered. Whereas when participation is more ample, when people in the communities are working together with the health professional to figure out what to name their problem, to decide on what to do, they're deciding with the professionals what to do. There's a much more ample sense of participation. I heard the first group mention the word instrumental. So the community is treated as an end. That's an instrumental way of thinking about participation. Most of our health programming looks like that. Why? Okay.
Più controllato.
Più scientifico.
Okay.
Così le cose possono rimanere così come sono, cioè creare trasformazione, in modo che ci sia una scala.
Okay.
E la risposta è una standard.
Okay.
Non viene creata responsabilizzazione, quindi è sempre un dare da fuori.
There's many things more that we can pull out of this exercise. Now we're going to do a bit of something called a double dialogue. Step back for a minute. Step back for a minute and think about the exercise itself. Okay. I can stand here and I can give you a lecture with no diagrams about the concepts of participation, the concepts of community-based work. I can give you some information. That's one way of teaching. What was different about this, doing this? What's different about it? What we just did, we went through an exercise. What are the characteristics of that exercise that make it different than a lecture? Okay.
Io ho dato qualcosa di conoscenza, cioè alle nostre conoscenze basate sulle nostre esperienze, le nostre sensazioni e le abbiamo messe a pari dignità di una conoscenza invece alla quale che sta in un livello più alto della gerarchia.
Noi abbiamo condiviso con l'intera classe, non solo con i docenti.
Che ha attivato tutti i nostri livelli.
Think about that for a minute in double dialogue. There's some characteristics of this kind of teaching. Not all teaching for transformation is always done. This is a technique, it's a method. But don't confuse pedagogy with method. They're two different things. One is thinking about all the things about how to teach, how to relate to your students. Normally in my classes, I know everybody's name. I know a little bit about everybody because I don't believe that I can teach very well to people that I don't. It doesn't work. I only had 3 hours, so just try to do a little bit of that. But it's important. The approach also means things about relationships. The approach means things about techniques and methods like this. But it's bigger than that. I think for me, transformative teaching, or teaching for transformation, is something that you learn in a very long time. It's not something that you pick up as a technique or a method. So we have a choice. We have about a half an hour, maybe 40 minutes right now. We have a choice. I know Chiara was interested in some of the theory behind transformative education. I have some slides on the theory, or we can have a dialogue about transformative teaching, about transformative education. It's up to you at this point. People want to hear a little bit about Nizara?
Yeah.
Mezzaro, one of the main theorists of transformative education, a bit about Freire. I made an assumption, another assumption, that many people here would know about Paulo Freire. Am I right? Is that a true assumption? No, I mean, depends on what you mean by no. No, of him. Okay. Well, we have a few minutes. We can't get very far, but let's start with Jenny. Jenny was using essentially some of the main tenets of Freirean pedagogy for our courses. Freire said that essentially there are three forms of education. There's instrumental or technical education, there's more liberal kinds of education, and then there's transformative education. Instrumental and technical is really what, medicine is plumbing at large. I mean, that's another way of looking at things. It's a whole lot of broken down body systems. It's instrumental. It's technical learning that has to take place. This is not a hierarchy. Liberal teaching is more an interchange with students and so forth, but it doesn't have necessarily as any kind of social change goals. Transformational teaching always has the goal of both changing the people's way of thinking about things and changing societal structures that keep people at different levels. Okay, so there's differences in goals. Freire started by saying, the way that we're teaching in school is producing professionals in schools, in universities, in health systems, in everywhere that is creating a form of development, because he was concerned with development. He said that it was creating a system where people had a group of experts and they were force feeding people knowledge. That was called banking education. He said banking education is enough. The bank of knowledge is held by the instructor, by the teacher. And they just deposit knowledge into the empty passive recipient. And he said that will never lead to true liberation. That can't lead to liberation. Because the starting point for all education has to be people's own experience. It has to be there. And the goal in engaging with other professionals or other teachers or facilitators, because at this point you can see that really it's not even, those roles are very much more facilitative than they are actually the role of teacher, that you always start with the actual experience that people have. He made some assumptions, and we'll get there. He made some assumptions about what kept people down around their own consciousness. And so his goal in working with people was to raise their level of consciousness about their own situation so that they would act on that. He wanted social change. What Jenny does when she enters into a community is she starts by listening to people's experiences. She listens not only, and this was a very important point that the first group mentioned, was she listens not only to how they talk about their experiences, but what they feel about them. Here's a simple little diagram that I used to use. So they're talking to each other, and she's listening with big ears. But there's something else that she's listening to. She's listening to what people feel strongly about. Because now let's jump forward, these are actually the actionable points. These are the things that matter to people. So this is what dialogue looks like. Dialogue is not something that's just you ask, you do some questions in a questionnaire and you get some answers. That's not dialogue. Dialogue implies a very ample form of participation. Dialogue implies listening, but listening not only to descriptions of experiences, but how people feel about them. And when people feel strongly about things, they're much more likely to engage in change on those things.
So the concept of dialogue was central to the beginning stages of conscientization. You enter into dialogue. So that's what Jenny does. She's entering in. She's listening. She's listening for affective as well as cognitive ways of describing it. So that's kind of one of the essential concepts, dialogue, right? Other let me just go to. So another of his, and this is really these were his pedagogical points. If you read Freire, you can read him for philosophy reasons. You can read him for strategy reasons. You can read him with a lot of different, he's an interesting theorist in that way. But he got into teaching for a reason. Well, his wife was a teacher. That's what got him interested in teaching, actually. You don't usually read that about Paulo Freire, but his wife was a teacher. He came from some rough background. He got interested in teaching because he said, this is a way this is a way for people to become liberated. So he got interested in teaching. So the pedagogical points are what I'm pulling out here. He has lots of other things to say about development, about philosophy. He has lots of other things to say. So it's worth reading that terribly written book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. That's his Bible. Terribly written, not personal. Pedagogy.
Maybe the English translation.
It's even in the original Portuguese, though people say it's not. He did a bit of ruminating in his book. Anyway, not to say. So central pedagogical points. How, and that means how do you teach there? You teach Freudian. You teach Freudian. Facilitator of their and just and you matters to them the most. And then he uses something called generative codes. He creates a code. This exercise is a code. It's a way to let us talk about teaching. It's a way for us to talk about approaches to community. It's a code. So you can use stories and drama and all kinds of techniques. But they're not just techniques, not just any techniques. They were techniques that were important because people felt them. There was something about it that was very important to them. So he would help them understand what was holding them down by having some kind of technique to enable them to talk about, to enable them to talk about things that were oppressing them. And theater of the oppressed, for example, is one sort of side thing that's come out of Freudian thinking. So that's a code. A code is a way for you or I to reflect on something that's going on. But we can see it better, and then we can think about our own situation. So in order to use a code, or to use a starting point, you would use this, essentially this format, where you would take some kind of code or use the actual experience of people and then ask them about it. You'd say, what are, effectively, what do you feel about this? What have you noticed? What's going on? Help them to enter into reflective spaces. So you reflect on something that's going on. And when you start to reflect on something that's going on, people would say, now I get it. And that's what he said, move people from magical consciousness to naive consciousness to a critical consciousness, to conscientization. There was a process that he had in mind to get people to become more aware. We call that conscientization. As people move through this cycle, they discover things about their own reality. They think about
well, what have I learned here that maybe I can put in practice? And they go back to put it in practice, to try something new, to think about something new. And when they do that, they enter into praxis, which is the other Freudian concept. So it moves from thinking about things and reflecting on things to putting them into place, to acting on it. Some of this is Freire, and some of this is how people have interpreted Freire over the years. In education, in health. So, honestly, how much of this actually came from Freire, we can test. But those three central points are really all over the literature about Freire's. They are his processes of entering into dialogue, of creating critical consciousness, of conscientization, and of working through praxis, cycles of praxis. Those are three basic, if you remember nothing else about Freire, if you remember those three things, and those are central to his pedagogy. But he's not the only guy on the panel. And he was criticized for some things. So, let me just get that up. Like, PowerPoint doesn't follow how I think. Okay, so Freire's central, he was working with very oppressed people in Brazil. He was working with very, groups of mostly people that couldn't read and write. That was the place where he developed his sort of his thinking and his methodology was there, working with those people. In general, when we work in universities, we're not working with them. In the teaching atmosphere here, we're helping people to be able to understand, to learn to work with people that are not like them, for whatever reason. But we're generally not working with that group of people. So other people started to think about other aspects of transformation, where Freire maybe left off. He didn't talk that much about sort of the personal transformations of people. He didn't do that much kind of psychoanalytic work. His was more concerned with transformations, social transformation. But personal transformation was something that is mostly associated with our next theorist, and let me just go really quickly through this. Mezirow. So jump ahead a bit. Mezirow had read Freire, but he was not working with the same population. He was mostly thinking about, okay, we've got some people coming back. He was working in a college, a community college. And he was working with groups of single mothers that were going back to school after a long time outside of school. So they were being reintegrated into the workforce. And so it was a different kind of oppressive circumstance in a way that they were living through. But that's the group of people he worked with to develop his theories of what's called prospective transformation. And what he wanted to understand is how do we help people be able to move through their kind of more naive thinking in a way, their more their acceptance of the way things are into more critical stances. How do we move them towards a more a permanent state of change in their minds about their own situation? And he found that there were 3 stages that the people that he was working with went through, and he actually there are 10 in his work, but there are 3 essential stages. And the first one was he often found that what starts people on a path of transformation is often something that disorients them. So it could be a life event, it could be a trauma, it could be, and I think if you all think to some moment in your life when, boom, you really got something, it's like something happens to you. It's almost like, that light bulb going off. And so for some people, some kind of life event that really shakes up who
who you thought you were can start you on a path of personal transformation. Another way that he found, there's two kinds, another way that he found that people started on this path was through kind of an incremental set of things that they kept on having a feeling of cognitive dissonance. Do you understand what I mean by cognitive dissonance? When you're thinking about somebody, it's not like what you know. And you're trying to understand, like your frames of reference don't match what you're going through. Right? It's sometimes when you travel, you can have that sort of feeling of what you thought you understood things were about were really different, and your frames don't match what you're encountering. Andrew's shaking his head back there, because I know from our conversation yesterday that some of that was going on for you. So he said that sort of that starting, the opening for people becoming open to change actually starts with one of those two kinds of experiences, either some kind of quite sharp and dramatic break from the past, where your whole world seems to be all of a sudden not the same as it was the moment before, or that a series of things that create some kind of cognitive dissonance cause you to rethink things. So I've called those aha experiences, or they can be incremental. Or they can be kind of mind fucks. I don't know, we call that, and that's a terrible word, but I mean, really, that's what we kind of are, where you're just not, all of a sudden, if something is so outside of your own experience, you have no way of understanding it. It throws you off. Those are opportunities, he said, for then moving into the next phase. Critical reflection is not the same as reflection. If I have a bad day, I have a bad experience, I'm really thrown off by something, and I go home and I write in my diary, I'm reflecting on it. And that's useful. But critical reflection is something else. Critical reflection, he said, in order to promote transformational kinds of paths, personal transformational learning, you need to actually either have someone facilitate you walking through making sense of that situation. It needs to be structured, he said, and it needs to be something where you're examining the socioeconomic, the epistemological, all the reasons why it might have happened at a level that's deeper than we would do on our own. So usually critical reflection happens in groups. And there's lots of techniques that you can use for promoting critical reflection. So when you have, for example, I know many of the people that are in teaching situations want their students to engage in some kind of critical reflection about some activity that they've done. It's one thing to reflect, and it's another to critically reflect. Those are two different activities in a way. So he said, when you enter into this kind of critical reflection, there's a shift in the awareness. And it's a shift that helps them make meaning, which is a central tenet of this always this search for making meaning of experience. He said, you can actually help people make meaning by critically reflecting on something, and that will help shift their awareness of who they are and where they are in the world, and for them to have like a second sense, where they don't just unquestioningly accept everything, all of the mainstream messages and the meta-narratives of society. They actually time over time by engagement in what Habermas called communicative learning. Still with me? Okay. He said critical reflection around one event helps people to make sense of that event and to move their thinking into a more critical stance. It helps them make sense of something that doesn't feel right anymore. But he said when people enter into what Habermas called the domain of communicative learning, where there was enough trust and safety to really Throw everything you know out the window and try on something completely new. That's what I'm using a popularized way of trying to help you understand this. Habermas's ideal conditions for communicative learning were really help making sure that the group was safe with each other, that there was a trust that had built up amongst the group, that there was enough space for people to try on different ideas without getting plastered by their teacher, for example. That when that space existed and people entered into it, and this happened over and over again, they were safe in taking on a new way of thinking, a completely transformed way of thinking about the world. They were okay with being involved in social change, for example. Maybe they come from very conservative, individualistic, perhaps highly structured and hierarchical family situations. And they've been invited through a series of things that didn't fit with what they thought they knew, living all their lives that way. They were invited to think about things differently when they were in this course, when they were in the school. And they had a critical piece of reflection that helped them see that that was a particular way of looking at the world, where they had come from. And then that situation within that classroom changes so that all people are engaging in a questioning of themselves and their background, and they're engaging in a questioning of societal structures that help us that keep people down. When they engaged in that together, they got to know each other in a way that made it safe, made it possible, made it actually a communicative domain in which they could actually take on that new personage. And that was the space of critical discourse. And he said that's when it made it possible for people to actually engage fully in this idea of transformative learning. This is not Mesereau. Mesereau has been critiqued and taken in many different directions by lots of different people. Transformative learning theory is not very good. It's not a very good theory. Because it doesn't help us really. It doesn't explain a lot of things that are still big questions for people. It doesn't explain the different, like, what does it take to move from knowledge to action? We don't understand that, even with all the behavioral theories and stuff. We really don't have a very clear idea of what really cements it in people. And the other thing that we don't have very clear, and that I've studied for years and years, is what sustains long-term commitments to change. One thing to be involved in all kinds of social change when you're in your 20s, maybe a little when you're in your 30s, but try hanging on to that until you're 75, 80, 90, through your whole life. Good question. People who work on personal transformation or working through this in a school situation say that what we want to try to help our students to do in order for them to sustain both personal and social transformation is for them to get on the path of transformative learning. And at OISE, this is the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, they say that transformative learning is a whole lot of things. That's huge. Transformative learning involves experiencing deep structural shifts in the basic premises of our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. The shift of consciousness dramatically and permanently alters your world. That shift often involves, those shifts involve understanding where we're coming from, being very aware, very reflexive, if you remember that at the beginning of our talk today. Our relationships with other people and with the planet, our understanding of the relations of power and how those interlock and intersect, our awareness of ourselves, our body, our corporal awareness, and visions of alternative possibilities. They say that this is what, when people get on that path and they take that on as a life way, that's what really we're trying to do with transformational education. That's huge. That's really huge. But, so the classroom, the spaces that we open up as educators to work with our students to create those kind of possibilities, that's the big challenge of pedagogy, of transformative pedagogy. How do we do that? we have some tools, we have some techniques, we have some ideas from Freire, we have some ideas from Mesro, we have some ideas actually from a very long list of people who are trying to figure this out. The theories are weak. There's lots of questions. People question Freire, for example, because he had very simplistic ideas about power and oppression, really. But they were very dualistic. And that's not very helpful when we have students sitting in a room, in a classroom, and they're saying they feel disempowered. Well, if they feel disempowered, and then we're saying that there's only two kind of people, there's powerful, there's oppressed and not oppressed, oppressed and oppressor, it's not complex enough to capture the full range of subjectivity, the full range of identity, the full range of how power operates in society. So then we have to go somewhere else for our theories of power. That was one of the big critiques of Freire.
Chiedo a parlo italiano. Siamo passati da transformative education a transformative learning, che sono due cose molto diverse, perché il transformative learning può, secondo me, non può che non essere dovuto a diversi fattori, mentre in transformative education uno ha l'idea dell'education che avviene in un luogo, non necessariamente un'aula, comunque in una educational institution.
Okay, this is important. Just a little intervention here. Yes, central point. Transformative education, education and learning, the difference that's often made by pedagogues. Education is structured in some way, whereas learning happens all the time in different circumstances for different reasons, right? So the point of transformative education is to get people on a path of transformative learning. A shift in their consciousness so that they'll sustain that. That's the personal part. A shift in our social relations and in society, that's the social part. So there's a personal part and a social part that we're trying to get people to get on the path of thinking about doing and doing. And we do that through structured educational experiences. When we're in the university setting, we can structure educational experiences to foster transformative learning. So that's the difference. Good question.
Una riflessione rispetto a quello che stavamo dicendo, che parlare di learning piuttosto di education, che in italiano non saprei come tradurlo, perché mi verrebbe da dire apprendimento. Però apprendimento non è, dire apprendimento non dà, secondo me, non trasmette il valore di azione e quindi non riporta la centralità dei soggetti nel processo, tanto quanto un verbo come può esprimere il learning piuttosto di apprendimento. E questo secondo me riappropriarci in un qualche modo del piano dell'azione, anche con le parole, è abbastanza fondamentale, perché ci permette di riflettere al nostro posizionamento e a che cosa producono le nostre azioni in quello che facciamo, piuttosto che pensare come l'apprendimento un qualcosa sé.
What other concepts might capture it? What other words are able to capture that?
Sì, è vero. Cioè, l'apprendimento, la parola apprendimento è connotata passivamente. L'apprendimento viene inteso come qualcosa che capita a una persona per fatti che gli succedono addosso. E invece manca l'aspetto proattività della
So it needs to be kind of reappropriated.
Anche apprendere vuol sempre inserire un contesto di una struttura in cui tu sei, quindi appunto una sovrastruttura forte, mentre imparare forse
A me piace.
di aggiungere imparare facendo, senza di più alla pratica.
What do children do before they get to school? What's the word that's used?
Imparare a prendere.
Maybe in some ways that's a more appropriate idea. I don't know.
Logicamente parlando, forse imparare indica qualcosa che viene all'interno, no? Però non so, è esattamente il contrario.
Imparare sia prepararsi, facciamo sia prendere sia prendere da, quindi forse c'è più una passività rispetto a prepararsi a, mi sembra più pratico la cosa di...
It's an important idea because one of the critiques, another kind of critique is when people really mechanistically take grading as being about only social change. We're really we're using our students as instruments rather than seeing them as fully human people with all the capacity to be whoever they are. And as instructors, as teachers, to me, you can't, if you really are working towards trying to facilitate long-term, very internalized changes in people and in society, it can't be just for actions. It also has to be about changing the way people think, the way they feel, how they understand things, internalize things. It's got to be both. So that's why, in some ways, that's why some of the methods you employ and the relationships that you have with your students speak very loud words about whether the classroom and whether university education is a dehumanizing experience or whether, in fact, it rehumanizes, rejuvenates, makes people think things are possible. Inside, not just, okay, got that strategy down because that's the strategy for organizing. Right? It has to be both. We don't want it to stop at one. I mean, the critique of Mesereau is because it's so psychoanalytic. It's like it's not going to create any big change in society. And the critique of Freud is that when it's instrumentalized in a classroom setting, all we're doing is using people for political parties, maybe for growing numbers in social movements, for. Both of those things can become mechanistic. So that's why. Let me come back to that first question that I asked about. It's a question that I've held for almost 4 decades. What happened? So much change happened to structures in society in a country that's been very near to my heart for a long time, in Nicaragua. Many changes to many structures. But a lot of people's personal transformation was left out. People were instrumentalized. Popular mobilizations were about getting massive quantities of people to the street, not about listening to what they had to say. It has to go. If there's more questions about these guys, and this is really hard to do in a very short time. There's lots and lots of extra stuff. One of the things that, again, when we talked about epistemology and activist knowledge, one of the things that's useful, and I know we've been talking about this, one of the things that's useful for ourselves as people that want to be engaged in transformative efforts, whatever that means to you, is to try to conceptualize, to get it down on paper, to create our own knowledge from all the experience that we gain when we're working with communities, when we're working with social movements, when we're working with organizing. There's a knowledge that gets created, and there's something that we learn about processes of social change. This diagram represents work that was done over 15 years with Philippine organizations working in health promotion. And they conceptualized sort of how
If you look at the very center of the flower on the left-hand side, it says a learning opportunity. So education can create a learning opportunity. And by the learning opportunity, the petals on it, it's a community-based, it's participatory, it's experiential, it's intercultural. Those are some of the features that the kind of learning opportunity, the kind of characteristics of that learning opportunity. What it needs to be able to touch on in order to achieve conscientization and a personal resolve to change, in order to acquire the knowledge and the skills necessary, it needs, it said, to work on various levels, personal, social, political. It needs to work on be at home in other spaces. It needs to have, all of these are things that they learn were the characteristics of the learning opportunity. That they tried to structure these into opportunities for people to create a resolve to personally transform. When those things were present, it created a potential to move things into the next realm, which is social transformation. This is what they found in their work. And they said that that transformation was on many levels. In the work that they were doing, they called it personal, community, work, and family. They organized those things through the cycles that we usually teach about, investigating, educating, action, praxis, in other words. The second circle represents, in a way, praxis. And that those things, by having that learning opportunity with those features, create a potential for transformation, working through the cycles of praxis. In fact, social transformation was going on. There were changes that were happening in the community they were working. So this is how they captured the work that they did over 15 years in working in particular communities in the Philippines. I find it a useful exercise to try to name it. We're losing people. It's called bullying.
You have to go to the
So I think we're actually probably. If people have any burning questions, maybe we should let you have.
I have burning questions, but maybe I will leave it for the end of.
This is the end. This is the end.
This is the end. Lo dico in italiano, non so come si. Io ho un'ammirazione personale di difesa, no? Difesa. Nel discorso che noi facciamo, no? Di critica alla scienza e alla tecnica, c'è un tentativo di decostruzione delle categorie, no? Che dominano il discorso. Possono essere quelle mediche, ma relative a qualsiasi altro dominio, no? Della conoscenza. Però quando noi facciamo questa critica, e in particolare quando il pensiero radicale di sinistra introduce questa critica, immediatamente introduce delle nuove categorie, che possono essere anche le categorie appunto di attivismo, cambiamento sociale, eccetera. Mi fa, cioè, non vorrei che così facendo si replichi e tutta questa teorizzazione un po' e questo lavoro di dominio culturale, secondo me, rischiano di argomentare appunto quello che sto dicendo, crei appunto una nuova divisione e una nuova appropriazione di domini della vita che dovrebbero al contrario, no, essere lasciati a un campo neutrale. Non neutrale, però come posso dire non neutrale, però personale, esperienziale. Ecco, questa è la mia idea.
Aiutami.
Sì, no, vorrei aggiungere e agganciarmi a quello che dice lui. Proprio perché hai detto la parola neutrale e partiamo
No, ma lo sai che
l'assunto,
non è
no,
quello
no,
che volevo intendere.
sto pensando, ma per agganciarmi a quello che dicevi, avanti. Proprio perché non può esistere una scienza neutrale, il discorso che facciamo, almeno che faccio io, è quello proprio di riappropriarsi, che qualcun altro si appropri della scienza. Finora la scienza è stata nelle mani, diciamo, del potere. E ora è il momento che cambiamo un tipo di scienza proprio perché qualcun altro è, diciamo, la comunità, il popolo, la gente, no? Il popolo, si appropri della scienza e costruiscono una nuova scienza. Questo è un salto di paradigma proprio uniano, non c'è dubbio. Tu non vorresti questo? O...
Io per dire un'altra cosa, allora forse non sono è difficile da spiegare.
Posso dire che secondo me io un po' ho capito quello che dici, però il primo punto di quello che ha detto Angelo è che non ti puoi sottrarre da un posizionamento.
Perché la scienza sia di qualcuno.
Cioè, non tanto che la scienza sia di
Posso dire una cosa,
qualcuno.
se ci diciamo sulla parola neutrale, che è una parola che
No,
non aveva...
posizionamento.
No, io non voglio dire neutrale, voglio dire che non puoi sfuggire alla responsabilità, che quello che dici appoggi da qualche parte, non so come dirti, no? Appunto perché, ok, tu dici non sostituiamo delle categorie scientifiche, se ho capito bene, allora, esatto, io ho capito che tu hai detto. Non stiamo con questa cosa di fatto sostituendo a un tipo di conoscenza degli altri strumenti, degli altri sguardi, laddove questo processo può essere solo un processo personale, quello di arrivare a questo no,
sì, è più o meno quello che dici, ma la conseguenza, così come relativamente al discorso della tecnica, sia un'espropriazione, no? Dei saperi tecnici non riconosciuti che le persone hanno, così anche mi pare che la stessa critica si possa portare parallelamente al campo del capitalismo oppure della trasformazione sociale, ma proprio in modo speculare. Soltanto che visto che viviamo in un mondo che tende ad andare in un'altra direzione, non siamo così disposti a non mettere questo rischio, questa conseguenza che logicamente ne deriva, secondo me.
Rischi una nuova introduzione di altre categorie
Esatto,
su
sì.
saperi.
Esatto. Cioè sono categorie diverse rispetto a quelle del discorso dominante, ma sono categorie che noi stiamo costruendo e se analizziamo la cosa, cioè, dal punto di vista estremamente analitico e anche freddo, nel momento in cui noi costruiamo queste categorie, gli diamo una forma, rischiamo di toglierle al ligno naturale, al ligno, non so come faccio fatica a trovare un'espressione per esprimere questo, però quando noi facciamo il discorso in modo opposto per la tecnica, noi usiamo queste categorizzazioni, quindi
posso provare a riprendere quello che ho detto nella sua frase? Cioè, allora, secondo me intanto io toglierei questa cosa del noi, loro, comunque anche questo discorso ogni tanto riecheggia, dobbiamo stimolare le capacità generative, cioè molto spesso la gente sta benissimo, usa le sue capacità di conoscenza, agisce, si muove in maniera competente in un mondo che per sé ha senso esattamente come facciamo noi, quindi la prima cosa che farei è riportare tutto su un piano di interazione in cui tu, però restituendo dignità, quindi ti sottrai anche da questo senso di responsabilità totale, per cui sei tu che vai a indirizzare le persone, cioè per fortuna non è così, perlomeno io non intenderei così il significato di quello che stiamo discutendo. E il secondo punto è che quindi lo riporterei il primo punto del discorso era quello della riflessibilità, quindi della consapevolezza di come tu articoli dei discorsi in un contesto sociale, che può essere da quest'aula, può essere In quel contesto sociale però, quello che dicevo prima è che è inevitabile che tu ti posizioni, se vuoi posizionarti, se puoi anche credere di non posizionarti, però forse la cosa migliore è appunto essere consapevoli che lo sei. A quel punto la tua diventa una posizione che pari dignità con tutte le altre, si gioca nell'interazione. Più tu nell'interazione sei in ascolto, accogliente e appunto relazionale, e secondo me più eviti il rischio di sostituire a categorie oggettive, categorie politiche, ma sempre in maniera intuitiva. Questo forse però ce ne vuole anche.
Io volevo, non so se riesco a spiegarmi e credo di no, però sicuro. Cioè, secondo me rispetto a questo, perché anche io mi ci intrago un sacco su questa cosa. Cioè, secondo me diventa, c'è il rischio e in qualche modo forse diventa effettivamente così. Diventa categoria nel momento in cui inserisci il discorso, anzi lo rivolgi a chi da categoria parla, cioè nel senso, come dire, se parli di un altro tipo di scienza a chi la scienza la detiene, per così dire, ed è spezzettata ed è sì, incasellata in categorie, di fatto questo tipo di struttura in un qualche modo plasma, cioè si riflette su, è come dire, è come se fosse il piano dell'interlocuzione che cerchi con chi stai cercando di fare questo discorso, cioè perlomeno non si capisce. No, vero?
Cioè, secondo me dici, se tu interagisci con chi ha già una forma mentis per cui del tutto secondo categoria, lo metterai in una categoria. Se interagisci con chi magari è brullo dal tuo punto di vista, puoi seminare
Cioè, chi non assume queste categorie nella propria conoscenza, diciamo così.
Cioè, non la prende come tema fisso e quindi non la include.
Sì, più o meno esatto, più o meno sì, scusa. La difficoltà secondo me è, o meglio, forse più in cui giocarsela, è per riflettere a quanto ci si prende sul serio nel momento in cui si adottano queste categorie per accedere ad una certa a certi interlocutori, ecco. E questo forse è il piano personale, che è la parte inquietante e è difficile da gestire, o perlomeno io mi ci trovo in difficoltà.
Secondo me le categorie non vanno neanche poi così tanto demonizzate, nel senso che il nostro cervello nei secondi in cui agisce, cioè le prime cose che fa è categorizzare, lo fa per sopravvivere, quindi non è una cosa secondo me la categoria è una cosa sulla struttura e tutto il resto. Cioè bisogna secondo me definire bene cos'è una categoria. Perché secondo quanto ho capito la stiamo facendo in maniera abbastanza negativa in questo contesto. Secondo me non lo è per forza. Cioè, questa mi sembra una proposta basata sull'esperienza di un atto buddista sull'educazione, sulla trasformazione e sulle ragioni della trasformazione.
I'm not sure if I'm capturing all of what's going on. In fact, I'm sure I'm not capturing all of what's going on. But I think I have a couple of quick observations, maybe that might help a little bit. To take on the idea of teaching for transformation does not mean that you don't do other kinds of teaching, that you don't use all kinds of knowledges, that you don't do that you don't teach for technical skills. Obviously, I don't want a doctor who's really good at organizing people, but he doesn't know how to sew up my arm when it's cut open. I mean, you need both, right? For example. So the point though is that there's forms of knowledge and there's forms of teaching and there's forms of interaction that can foment a particular set of skills. If we only have technical skills, we only use scientific knowledge, we only use banking education, we're missing out on a whole lot of things that people who are engaging with others, whether it's in groups or communities or even just with patients, they're missing out on a whole lot of other kinds of skills. We need technical skills, but we need group skills. We have to have a potential for personal and spiritual growth within our education, or else we're turning people's lights out, dehumanizing them. All of those things have to be present. So it's not one or the other. It's not a replacement of one kind of education for another. It's not a replacement of one kind of. It's a recognition of the multiplicity, and it's a use of the particular form when, if we want to have social change, and we only ever teach technical banking education, there's a problem. So, just to say, this is one form of education with a whole lot of things that are possible in using these kinds of pedagogies that you often don't get that much exposure to in university. But yet we want to have people that are skilled at working with communities. We want to have people that are skilled at organizing. We want to have people that are skilled in interpersonal relations. But we don't offer the opportunity for them to learn.
No, io sono parecchio confuso in questo momento, uno perché sono stanco e fame, quindi. Però il discorso è, cioè noi, quello che stavo cercando di capire è se noi vogliamo passare da un sistema che potremmo in parte definire statico, questo social transformation va verso un altro sistema che poi è statico, che forse in parte si riaggancia a quello che dicevi tu, oppure poi io dicevo, beh, ma anche in questo punto con la tua stessa osservazione, se è un sistema statico, cioè passiamo dalla padella alla braccia, cioè passiamo da una cosa a una cosa leggermente diversa, ma che comunque poi ha gli stessi problemi. Oppure se la social transformation è di per sé la fine del nostro percorso, ovvero la capacità di creare un sistema che sia, permettetemi, liquido, ormai Bauman si usa questo termine, però nel senso capace di ascoltare continuamente, di essere capace di essere appunto una trasformazione continua verso non un qualche cosa di definito, ma una capacità di continuamente di organizzarsi e di adattarsi alle nuove.
That's a good question. There's no answer. There's no answer. You figured that out. Beh, comunque io credo che la storia di Jenny sia molto esplicativa, no? Cioè lei non è andata lì perché doveva fare gli ordini comunitari, doveva passare dalla banca del cibo agli ordini comunitari, quindi ha insegnato alla gente come farlo, cioè è a finale aperto, no? Quello che sta da fuori non puoi sapere.
Cioè la trasformazione è essere pronti a continuare a trasformarsi.
Sì, e probabilmente anche autodeterminare, cioè come dire, no, di appropriarsi di un senso di controllo, di decisione, di pienezza dell'esistenza.
Da medico adesso mal di testa.
Bene, grazie.
Grazie.
Saluto la camera, anche no? Dove c'è? Io no.